I'm Michael Sterling. I should have known better. Maybe I did. In a way that only makes regret sharper now. It started like any other day at the lab, the fluorescent lights humming above, the tang of disinfectant in the air, the low mechanical thrum of the HEPA ventilation systems that I'd spent the last decade learning to trust. We were handling something no human should ever touch. An engineered strain of smallpox designed to test its absolute limits, lethality, transmissibility, the full potential of a virus that had killed millions in centuries past. We called it Variola X, but even that name felt inadequate, almost polite for what it really was. I remember that morning with an odd clarity. The corridors were quiet, empty, but for a handful of early shift researchers like me. We all wore our standard suits, full body protective suits, powered respirators, double gloves, the works. Every movement was precise, rehearsed, necessary. Protocol dictated everything. Every vial, every sample, every procedure had layers of redundancy. That's how we convinced ourselves we were safe. But we weren't. It was a mistake almost absurd in its simplicity. One of the junior technicians, probably distracted, failed to seal the final containment chamber after finishing the virus culture transfer. I don't know if she realized immediately. She probably didn't. The negative pressure system, our primary line of defense, failed to engage completely. A filter malfunction, an unnoticed switch, a tiny misalignment in a ventilation duct. Enough. Just enough. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't see the tiny invisible particles of Variola X slip out into the lab's air system, drifting unnoticed along metal ducts, twisting through the tunnels that connected our building to nearby research facilities. But I felt it immediately afterward, in the back of my mind, when I noticed her expression. Pale, wide-eyed, frozen as though she'd just glimpsed the end of the world and didn't know how to stop it. Containment secure? I asked, a casual phrase we all used, though no one ever said it casually. She nodded, too quickly. I left it at that. I didn't want to think about it. By the afternoon, the first signs appeared. Not among the lab team, yet those of us vaccinated, trained, hyper-aware, but outside in the world. One of our courier trucks had passed through the building's peripheral air system to another facility. It returned empty, routine check. But in the days after, the first hospital reports trickled in. Unusual cases, fever, fatigue, blisters that formed almost invisibly, then erupted. Doctors puzzled. Nothing on the charts matched it. I remember reading the initial case files with disbelief, even arrogance. It can't be smallpox, I told myself. We wouldn't have missed it inside the lab. But we had. And the virus didn't care. Within a week, local clinics reported clusters of respiratory distress and hemorrhagic symptoms. By then, I could see the pattern. High fever, rapid skin lesions, aggressive respiratory complications. Not all cases ended in death, but the fatality rate was climbing at a rate that made epidemiologists whisper in shock. A few hospitals started to suspect something far more dangerous than seasonal influenza. A couple of courageous doctors filed urgent reports to the Centers for Disease Control. By the time we acknowledged it, the virus had already seeded itself across multiple regions. I was part of the internal task force assigned to analyze what had gone wrong. My days became a blur of lab tests, genetic sequencing, and frantic simulations. We watched the spread like spectators to a wildfire, except the fire was microscopic, invisible, indifferent. Every model showed one terrifying conclusion. Variola X wasn't just lethal. It was optimized for spread. Airborne droplets lingered longer than expected. Viral shedding occurred before symptoms even became obvious. And secondary infections were multiplying faster than we could trace. We argued endlessly over containment strategies, lockdowns, quarantines, travel restrictions, but every recommendation collided with bureaucracy, politics, and disbelief. Governments hesitated until it was almost too late. By the time travel bans were implemented in major cities, the virus had already hopped continents via asymptomatic carriers. We realized, bitterly, that we had underestimated human mobility and overestimated compliance. And all the while, I kept thinking about that day in the lab, about a single misplaced vial, a single malfunctioning filter, one imperfection in a system designed to be flawless. By week 2, the first stories began to appear in mainstream media. They were small, easily dismissed: unusual flu outbreak, mysterious respiratory illness. But for us, for those of us who knew, they were harbingers of disaster. I watched footage of crowded hospital waiting rooms, watched exhausted nurses wear the same mask for hours, watched doctors argue over triage protocols that had never been designed for something this contagious. I felt a suffocating weight, a sense that every day we delayed, every miscommunication, every bureaucratic pause, cost lives. I started documenting everything. Each symptom reported, each fatality, each breach in containment. I wrote in the lab's secure digital logs at first, then on scraps of paper when I couldn't access secure systems. Later, I realized I was writing for someone who would never read it. Maybe the world, maybe nobody. It didn't matter. I had to write. Writing kept me sane. The first real panic came when a nearby city declared a localized quarantine. Residents barricaded themselves indoors. Grocery stores emptied within hours. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Even the military was called in to maintain order. I watched on monitors, helpless, as panic magnified the danger. The virus didn't need guns or tanks to spread, just a crowd, just a cough, just someone touching a contaminated surface. And the human cost wasn't abstract. I knew people who were infected, colleagues, friends, faces blurred by fever and fear. Some died alone in hospital rooms. Some carried the virus home before they even knew they were sick. Families were devastated. Cities that had seemed vibrant one week were now eerily silent. Sirens became a constant background noise. By the end of the third week, the CDC and WHO confirmed what we had all feared. Variola X was not containable by conventional means. Standard smallpox vaccines offered partial protection, but many of our test subjects were already beyond reach. Antivirals existed, but supply was minimal, and production lagged behind demand. We were watching history repeat itself, a global biological disaster, born of human ambition, error, and hubris. I spent those nights in the lab alone, staring at the empty containment rooms where the virus had once been secured. I remember the cold hum of the refrigeration units, the quiet clink of glass vials, and the eerie stillness that seemed to mock our efforts. Outside, the world was unraveling. But inside, it felt like time had stopped, a waiting room for a nightmare that had already begun. I've come to understand that our understanding of science is a fragile thing. It gives the illusion of control. It reassures us that we can predict, contain, and cure. But no matter how advanced our models, how strict our protocols, how brilliant our minds, one small failure, one human failure, can undo it all. Now, weeks later, I am still here. I watch the reports, read the papers, communicate with colleagues who are scattered, isolated, or gone. My protective suits sit untouched in their lockers, a reminder of a battle that cannot be fought in gloves and masks alone. Every day is a question. How many are infected? How many have already died? How many more will succumb before the world even comprehends what has happened? I am Michael Sterling, and I watched the world begin to fall apart in the shadow of something we created. I write this not for glory, not for absolution, but because it matters that someone knows. Someone must understand the cost of curiosity, the price of hubris, and the fragile boundary between knowledge and catastrophe. Because once the virus escaped, nothing would ever be the same. By the time the first wave hit, it was impossible to ignore. I had spent weeks buried in data, lab tests, simulations, and logs, trying to track the virus's path, trying to calculate its trajectory. I had watched numbers climb, clusters form, and patterns emerge that no model could fully capture. And still, the world seemed unprepared, almost willfully blind. The first confirmed hospital clusters were small, isolated. A few dozen patients in one city, then another few dozen in a nearby town. Symptoms were deceptive at first. Mild fever, fatigue, cough. Nothing alarming enough to trigger mass panic. Doctors treated the patients like seasonal flu, unaware that they were the first casualties in a chain reaction that would spiral out of control. By the third day of the first cluster, some patients developed the hallmark pox lesions. That's when alarm bells finally rang. Variola X didn't just resemble smallpox, it was more aggressive. Lesions appeared sooner, spread faster, and often coincided with severe respiratory distress. Mortality rates skyrocketed. Within a week, a single infected individual could inadvertently expose dozens of others. I was called into emergency meetings at the lab. Scientists, epidemiologists, public health officials, all frantic, all grasping for some control that didn't exist. We discussed isolation protocols, contact tracing, emergency vaccination campaigns. Every option seemed inadequate. Supplies were limited. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Staff were falling ill themselves. We realized quickly that containment at this stage was no longer possible through conventional measures alone. The virus had already outpaced us. Air travel, commuting patterns, the sheer density of human populations, these variables made the spread exponential. Even if we had caught it immediately, the window for stopping it had already closed. And yet, people clung to hope. Governments issued advisories, local authorities set up quarantine zones, and the media reported cautiously, trying not to incite panic. But panic was inevitable. Grocery stores emptied in hours. Traffic on highways became gridlocked, with families fleeing perceived danger zones. Hospitals filled beyond capacity. Ambulances queued for hours outside emergency wards. I remember one night vividly. I walked through the city streets, masked and gloved, carrying a small sample for testing. It was eerily silent. Shops were shuttered. Streetlights flickered over empty sidewalks. Occasionally, I saw a neighbor through a window, staring out with fear etched into their features. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire city held its breath, waiting for something none of us could name. By the end of the first week, hospitals reported a terrifying trend: secondary infections among healthcare workers. Even with proper protective equipment, the virus was slipping through. Mask protocols, gloves, and isolation rooms slowed it, but could not stop it. The virus exploited every weakness in human systems: fatigue, distraction, lapses in procedure. I spent long nights in the lab, working with a small, exhausted team. We tested antiviral treatments, sequenced viral genomes, and cross-referenced patient data. Nothing we tried produced a miracle. Some patients responded partially to treatment, but many succumbed within days. It was relentless. The human body, brilliant in its complexity, was being overrun. Communication became critical. We needed to warn other cities, other countries. Yet, bureaucracy slowed every attempt. Emails went unanswered, conference calls postponed. International protocols required approvals that no one could wait for. Meanwhile, the virus traveled silently, moving faster than paperwork. I kept a personal log. Every patient I tracked, every death, every failure. It was my anchor to reality, my attempt to impose order on chaos. I recorded symptoms, viral load data, and contact histories. Every log reinforced the horrifying reality. We were witnessing a pandemic, and there was no playbook for what was coming. Then came the moral dilemmas. Families begged for hospital access. Hospitals turned them away, citing lack of beds, lack of staff, lack of hope. I had to make impossible decisions. Who received care? Who was left to die? Every choice felt like a violation of the very principles I had spent my life defending. By the second week of the first wave, cities instituted strict lockdowns. Police and military enforced quarantine zones. Streets were patrolled, checkpoints established. Curfews became mandatory. But human behavior defied regulation. Crowds gathered secretly, desperate for food or supplies, inadvertently spreading the virus further. Fear amplified risk. Desperation made people dangerous to themselves and others. News reports filtered through sporadically, fragmentary and sometimes inaccurate. The public knew only pieces of the truth: rising infection rates, overwhelmed hospitals, local deaths. Rumors flourished, exaggerating reality, sometimes minimizing it. Social media became both a lifeline and a hazard, a way to share information, but also a vector for misinformation that undermined control efforts. Through it all, I watched colleagues and friends succumb. One by one, our numbers dwindled. Some isolated themselves, refusing contact even with loved ones. Some ignored safety protocols out of despair or denial. Each loss left a scar, a personal reminder of how fragile human life had become in the face of a virus we could not see. In my lab, we began simulating worst-case scenarios. If unchecked, the virus could infect millions within months. Healthcare infrastructure would collapse. Food supply chains would break. Social order would erode. Governments might attempt martial law. The projections were grim, but even the grimest underestimated human mobility and virus adaptability. And yet, I could not stop. I could not give in to despair completely. I kept documenting, testing, theorizing. Every sample, every patient file, every map of viral movement was a thread in an intricate tapestry I hoped could inform future response. Maybe, if someone read these logs, they could prevent repetition. Maybe they could save lives. We could not. Even as the first wave crested, the virus was already mutating slightly. Subtle shifts that made detection harder, treatment less effective. Variola X seemed almost sentient in its efficiency, exploiting every human error, every systemic weakness, every lapse in judgment. We had built it to be powerful, and now it was using that power to challenge us in ways we could barely comprehend. By the third week of the first wave, the world outside the lab had changed irrevocably. Cities were ghost towns, hospitals were burial grounds, and ordinary life had ceased. People moved cautiously, silently, wearing masks and gloves, avoiding one another with an instinctual fear. Entire communities were quarantined, some forcibly, some voluntarily. The fabric of society frayed under pressure, exposing fault lines of inequality, mistrust, and desperation. Through it all, I remained in the lab, a witness and participant in the slow unraveling of civilization. I knew the virus had no conscience, no agenda beyond replication and spread. But humans had conscience, and ours was failing under the weight of impossible choices. Every day, I asked myself, how did we get here? How did a single breach lead to this global catastrophe? And most terrifying of all, how many waves would follow? I am Michael Sterling, and I am still here, still watching, still recording. I do not know how much longer I can continue. But I must. Because if we do not document this, if we do not understand it, the mistakes will be repeated, and Variola X will find us again. By the time the virus reached the international stage, the world had already begun to fray. Borders that once seemed inviolable became irrelevant overnight. Airplanes carried passengers incubating the virus. Shipping routes transmitted it silently. We saw firsthand that Variola X had no respect for geography, politics, or wealth. Every city, every country was vulnerable. I kept detailed logs, a habit born of necessity and obsession. Each day I documented the spread, the deaths, the failures. I began numbering waves, though I knew there would be no simple categorization. The first wave had been only a prelude. The second wave, ignited by human movement and the initial breakdown of containment, would devastate us in ways that no model could accurately predict. Hospitals were now collapsing en masse. Entire wards were quarantined, entire staff infected or dead. Makeshift treatment centers sprang up in stadiums and convention halls, but these were little more than triage stations. Supplies ran short, ventilators were rationed, medications were diverted from other diseases. Every day brought a new nightmare scenario. Governments attempted emergency measures, but coordination failed. The virus had already exposed systemic weaknesses that were impossible to fix in real time. Nations turned inward, closing borders, halting trade, imposing curfews, and deploying military units to enforce isolation zones. Yet, no amount of regulation could overcome the virus's lethality and transmission speed. People behaved unpredictably. Some followed guidelines meticulously, masking, isolating, sanitizing. Others ignored the warnings entirely, either in disbelief or out of desperation. Social order disintegrated in many regions. Looting became common. Communities barricaded themselves, refusing entry to outsiders. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor, and mistrust became a survival mechanism. I remember walking through a quarantine district one evening. From a distance, I could see families huddled in their homes, windows shuttered, lights dimmed. Occasionally, someone would appear on the street, masked, cautious, moving only when necessary. The silence was oppressive, a tangible weight pressing against everything. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. In the lab, we were operating at the limits of endurance. Our team had shrunk, some lost to infection, others to despair. We worked around the clock, trying to analyze viral samples, model transmission patterns, and test potential treatments. The virus was relentless, mutating subtly, evading detection, exploiting human error at every turn. International organizations scrambled to coordinate, but the bureaucracy was slow and the virus was fast. Data sharing was incomplete, often delayed. Some countries underreported infections either to avoid panic or to maintain political appearances. Others were too overwhelmed to track cases at all. Our models became approximations, educated guesses at best. Supply chains fractured. Food scarcity became widespread, compounding the crisis. Hospitals, unable to procure basic necessities, improvised. Clean water was in short supply. Pharmaceuticals for other diseases vanished as resources were diverted to variola X. The death toll rose not only from infection, but from systemic collapse. I began seeing the psychological toll in patients and staff alike. Fear manifested as paranoia, aggression, and despair. Some healthcare workers abandoned their posts, unable to continue. Others clung desperately to routines, a fragile attempt at normalcy in a world that no longer had any. I myself felt the creeping pressure of isolation, the weight of responsibility pressing against my chest like a physical force. By the 5th week of the outbreak, the virus had reached every continent. International travel bans had slowed its pace, but could not stop it. Dense urban centers were particularly vulnerable. The virus thrived in close quarters, in public transport, in crowded markets. Rural areas were not spared either, though spread was initially slower. But no region remained untouched. Communication with the outside world became fragmented. Phone lines were jammed. Internet access was sporadic. News agencies struggled to report accurately amid chaos. Rumors ran rampant, sometimes more believable than facts. People feared the unknown more than the known. In many cases, communities turned inward, cutting themselves off from any external contact, hoping isolation would provide safety. I began to question humanity itself. The virus did not discriminate, but people did. Inequality dictated who survived and who did not. Those with resources could flee to isolated estates, hire private care, and access experimental treatments. The poor, the marginalized, were left exposed, forced to navigate streets teeming with infection and desperation. I documented this meticulously because it mattered. Someone needed to know. As the weeks passed, containment strategies became increasingly desperate. Mass vaccination campaigns were attempted, but our stockpiles were limited. Emergency manufacturing ramped up, but distribution was slow, and every delay meant more lives lost. Quarantine zones were enforced with military precision, but enforcement often triggered riots. People were willing to risk infection rather than starve. One night, exhausted and delirious from lack of sleep, I walked through our makeshift lab corridors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Every room contained a microcosm of chaos. Samples waiting for testing, phones ringing unanswered, exhausted staff murmuring in broken sentences. And yet, despite the despair, work continued. We could not stop. If we did, humanity's last chance would be gone. I began to understand that survival was no longer just a matter of biology. It was a matter of information, timing, and decision-making. Every choice had consequences. Who to test, who to treat, where to allocate resources. Every failure multiplied exponentially. And the virus, indifferent and precise, exploited every misstep. By the 7th week, societal collapse was visible everywhere. Hospitals functioned as burial sites more than treatment centers. Schools were closed indefinitely. Public services were minimal. Law enforcement struggled to maintain order. In some cities, the only sound after nightfall was the occasional siren or the distant wail of someone mourning. Through it all, I continued documenting. I recorded patient data, viral sequences, mortality trends, and the failings of response systems. My journal became both a weapon and a shield. A weapon against ignorance, a shield against despair. Without documentation, all this knowledge would vanish with the dead. Without structure, I feared I too would vanish, swallowed by the chaos I witnessed daily. By the 9th week, Variola X had become the defining force of our existence. Normalcy, as we had known it, was a memory. Every action, every thought was dictated by the presence of the virus. Every human interaction became a calculated risk. And every death was a reminder that we were, in many ways, powerless. I am Michael Sterling, and I'm still here, still documenting, still watching. The collapse continues, wave after wave, and yet I cling to the hope that understanding, knowledge, and perseverance can save those who remain. If nothing else, I will ensure that the story of this virus, and the story of us, does not disappear. The world had become unrecognizable. By the 10th week of the outbreak, cities were hushed. eerily devoid of the human activity that once defined them. Even in small towns, life had slowed to a crawl. Streets were empty except for the occasional masked survivor scavenging for essentials. The virus had stripped society down to its bare bones, leaving fear, death, and isolation in its wake. I moved cautiously through the city each day, masked, gloved, and fully aware that every surface, every breath of air could be lethal. My lab, once a center of frantic activity, had become a fortress, a place of both sanctuary and obsession. Within its walls, we continued testing, recording, and theorizing. Outside, chaos reigned. Supplies were now dangerously scarce. Food shortages forced people into desperate measures. Looting and theft became common, though rarely organized. Most people scavenged alone, moving cautiously to avoid contact with others. Communities had barricaded themselves, trusting nothing beyond their own walls. But isolation carried its own dangers. People fell into despair, succumbing to hopelessness faster than the virus claimed their bodies. Hospitals were non-existent in many regions. Makeshift care centers were few and far between, staffed by volunteers too exhausted to continue. Those with the virus often faced death alone or in cramped, unsanitary conditions. I documented everything I could: patient histories, viral behavior, treatment attempts. But even I began to feel the crushing weight of futility. Morality became a daily battlefield. Decisions that once seemed unimaginable were now routine. I had to decide who received limited antiviral doses, who could enter the lab safely, who would be allowed to leave isolation zones. Every choice carried consequences. Every consequence carried death. I questioned myself constantly. Am I saving lives or dooming them? The line blurred daily. Communication with the outside world had almost entirely collapsed. News reports were sporadic, fragmented, and often unreliable. Rumors ran rampant. People whispered of entire towns wiped out, governments falling, and entire continents quarantined. Social media, once a tool for connection, had become a vector for misinformation and panic. It was impossible to know what was true. I kept moving, visiting quarantine districts, documenting survivors, and tracking infection patterns. Some people had learned to live with the virus, adapting routines to reduce risk. Others had surrendered to despair, leaving themselves exposed. Communities that survived did so through strict discipline, isolation, and the willingness to enforce harsh rules. By the 12th week, the virus had changed subtly. Mutations emerged, small but significant. Symptoms in some patients became unpredictable. Some developed severe neurological effects. Others experienced gastrointestinal complications that complicated treatment. We were chasing a moving target, always one step behind, and the virus was relentless in its efficiency. Desperation pushed humanity to extremes. Some groups turned violent, raiding supplies, forcing entry into isolated zones, killing to survive. Others became hermits, refusing contact entirely, letting fear dictate every decision. I witnessed both extremes firsthand. In one district, a small group of survivors barricaded themselves in an abandoned school, armed and fearful, while outside, another group tried to break in, shouting threats and waving weapons. Survival instincts had overridden reason. I began questioning the purpose of my documentation. Was it simply an exercise in futility? Or could knowledge save future generations? I clung to the hope that someone, someday, would read these logs and understand. Perhaps they could prevent humanity from repeating these mistakes. Perhaps Variola X would be studied and contained before it had another chance. Isolation became a psychological weapon. I spent long nights alone in the lab, hearing only the hum of equipment and the occasional distant siren. Dreams became fragmented, nightmares intruding even during waking hours. I questioned my own sanity. Was I seeing patterns in the virus, or was my mind grasping at illusions to maintain a sense of control? Despite the horror, I pressed on. Testing continued, though progress was slow. Small successes emerged. Partial antiviral responses, slight improvements in early detection. But these were rare, fragile victories. The virus adapted faster than our interventions. Every triumph was temporary, every setback monumental. Humanity's resilience was tested in ways no one could have imagined. Families that survived together did so through strict routines and unyielding discipline. Communities that adapted quickly fared better, but few were truly safe. The virus had become both a biological and social force, exploiting not only our bodies, but our weaknesses as a species. By week 15, I realized that survival was no longer just about avoiding infection. It was about maintaining humanity. It was about finding purpose amid despair. I documented acts of kindness, rare though they were. One family shared rations with another, despite the risk. A retired doctor volunteered to treat patients in a makeshift ward. Small gestures became lifelines, reminders that even in collapse, some threads of decency remained. Yet, the virus did not care. Variola X was indifferent to morality, empathy, or strategy. It spread, adapted, and killed with cold efficiency. Every day brought new waves of infection, new victims, and new failures. The body count was staggering, the psychological toll impossible to measure. Humanity's arrogance had met its match in a microscopic adversary we had created ourselves. By week 18, the world outside the lab had changed completely. Cities were ruins, some abandoned entirely. Supply chains were fractured beyond repair. Communication networks were intermittent. Government structures had collapsed in many regions. People were scattered, surviving in isolated pockets, dependent on luck, discipline, and sheer willpower. I continued documenting, recording patient histories, viral mutations, survival strategies, and moral decisions. My journal became both shield and weapon, a testament to what had happened, a blueprint for what might come. I knew that Variola X would continue to challenge humanity, perhaps for years. But knowledge, at least, could persist. I am Michael Sterling, and I'm still here, still documenting, still surviving. I do not know how much longer I can endure, but I must. For every life lost, for every failure, for every lesson learned, I will ensure that the story is told. The virus may be relentless, but the human spirit, fragile though it may be, refuses to vanish entirely. By the 20th week, the world had shifted into something unrecognizable, something that no maps, governments, or histories could accurately describe. Civilization had fractured into fragments. Isolated communities, scattered survivors, and the occasional ghost town, each a testament to human resilience and human failure. Variola X had reshaped the planet with brutal efficiency, leaving only scattered remnants of humanity behind. I moved cautiously, still masked, still aware of the invisible enemy that could end my life in hours. My lab had become more than a research facility. It was a sanctuary, a vault of knowledge, and a lifeline. Every sample, every observation, every note I had kept mattered now more than ever. The virus was still out there, still mutating, still lethal, but knowledge could provide the slim chance of survival. Supply lines were non-existent. Food was scavenged, filtered, and rationed with precision. Water had to be boiled, purified, and guarded. Every step outside the lab was a risk of infection, of violent violence, of sheer exhaustion. The virus had not only decimated populations, but it also stripped humanity of infrastructure, its systems, and its sense of security. I visited a few of the remaining communities. Each had developed its own rules, its own methods of survival. Some were brutal, enforcing strict isolation, rationing, and even harsh punishment for those who disobeyed. Others tried to maintain semblances of normalcy: gardens, schools, communal kitchens, but all lived under the constant shadow of Variola X. Even the most careful were not safe. One sneeze, one careless moment, and a community could be decimated in hours. I documented everything. My journal had become a chronicle not only of disease, but of humanity in extremis. I recorded how survivors scavenged, how they adapted, how they endured. I recorded the mutations of the virus, the failed treatments, and the rare, fragile victories of those who managed to survive infection. The knowledge was precious, perhaps the only thing that could outlast the virus itself. The psychological toll had reached a breaking point for many. Isolation, fear, and grief had created new forms of suffering as real as infection. Survivors were haunted by the dead, by the lives lost in a matter of weeks. Communities that had lost half or more of their members functioned in a kind of suspended reality. Rituals, routines, and obedience replacing social bonds and culture. Hope existed, but only as a flicker, a faint pulse in the darkness. I began to notice patterns emerging among survivors. Those who adapted most successfully were not always the strongest physically, but the most disciplined mentally. Routine, caution, and willingness to enforce strict boundaries were the difference between life and death. In some communities, children were raised entirely within isolation, learning survival before learning society. In others, desperation had led to chaos, violence, and early extinction. Variola X itself had evolved subtly. Some mutations seemed to reduce lethality slightly but increased transmission. Others caused unpredictable symptoms that complicated treatment. The virus had become a permanent, omnipresent threat, one that could flare and fade in unpredictable waves. Humanity was no longer contending with a single outbreak, but with a long, grinding battle against an evolving pathogen. I continued my work in the lab, documenting every observation, testing every possible antiviral strategy, and attempting to synthesize vaccines. Our limited stockpiles had been depleted, but the knowledge remained. If humanity could survive, it would be because of understanding, preparation, and persistence. Knowledge, perhaps, could become the ultimate weapon against a virus that had already claimed millions. I also documented the social and moral consequences of survival. Communities faced impossible decisions: who to save, who to leave behind, who could enter or be expelled. Humanity had been forced to redefine ethics under conditions of extreme scarcity. Compassion and cruelty existed side by side, and both were amplified by the pressures of survival. By the 25th week, I realized that the world I had known no longer existed. Major cities were abandoned or reduced to ruins. Entire nations had ceased to function in any recognizable way. Borders and governments were meaningless. The virus had leveled humanity's infrastructure, leaving only scattered enclaves, isolated survivors, and the relentless presence of variola X. In one particularly haunting moment, I walked through an abandoned city center. The streets were littered with debris, vehicles left where they had broken down, shops empty, windows shattered. Signs of life lingered faintly. Newspapers fluttered in the wind, half-filled coffee cups sat on tables, a lone bicycle lay in the gutter. But no humans remained. It was a graveyard, but a living one, for the virus still moved unseen. I documented these scenes meticulously. They were lessons for the future. They were warnings. They were reminders of the consequences of hubris, of human failure to anticipate the dangers of the very tools we had created. Variola X was a testament to both human ingenuity and human recklessness. Amid the devastation, I still encountered acts of resilience. One isolated community had cultivated a small garden in a cleared city square, irrigated by hand, defended by a few dedicated survivors. They had survived not through strength or luck alone, but through discipline, planning, and sheer determination. Another group had constructed a rudimentary clinic using salvaged materials and was caring for those unlucky enough to be infected, knowing the odds were slim, but refusing to abandon hope entirely. I realized that the virus had not only tested our biology, but our humanity. Some had succumbed to despair, others to violence, but a few had endured. Survival was not guaranteed, but persistence created the slim chance for the future. Knowledge, discipline, and human willpower were the tools left to continue the struggle. By the 32nd week, I understood that variola X would remain a threat for years, perhaps decades. The virus had become endemic, a permanent shadow over civilization. Humanity, fractured and diminished, would have to learn to coexist with it. The question was no longer if we could eliminate it entirely. It was whether we could survive it at all. I documented this truth with painstaking care. Every observation, every moral decision, every instance of survival mattered. The virus had taken nearly everything, but it had not yet taken knowledge. And knowledge, I believed, could become our salvation. I am Michael Sterling. I am still here, still documenting, still bearing witness. The world is broken, but the fragments of humanity remain. Some may survive, some may adapt, some may perish. And when the story is told through journals, data, and memories. The truth of variolags and its consequences will not be forgotten. The virus may endure, but so will the record of what it wrought. Humanity's struggle is far from over, but the lessons remain. And for now, that is enough.